Thanks very much for this opportunity. In fact, the person who should be up here speaking to you all is Diego Lobrega, postdoctoral fellow working with us. But like all good postdocs, they barely get their feet on the ground and they get hired away. So Diego's in the process of moving his family to Calgary because he's got a new position at the University of Calgary, which is we wish him all well there, and we'll continue to work with him, and he will continue to work with us. But anyhow, so I'll try to do this justice. Essentially, this project came about because there was interest on the part of dairy farmers of Ontario and ourselves to look at the utility of bulk tank milk samples for disease surveillance and disease monitoring. It has some potential to allow us to track new and emerging diseases like Salmonella Dublin. It gives us the opportunity to, again, touch base and see how we're doing as a province or country or region in terms of endemic diseases, things like Johne's, leukosis, and other things. And also, DFO particularly, we're interested in working through the complexity of getting permission and the logistics of accessing these samples for testing in case of an emergency situation like foot and mouth disease. So all these things came together, so it was funded by DFO and OMAFRA, and we engaged in this particular project. So the idea of using a bulk tank milk sample for surveillance is really appealing, right? We've got one sample that represents certainly all the milking cows in the herd, so it's quick, easy to access, and potentially inexpensive. Having said that, that one sample represents all of the milking cows in the herd, so whether that's a large herd or small herd, and each of those cows is contributing a different volume proportion to that sample. So there's some challenges in terms of interpretation. We can apply a number, and we've got more and more tests every day, ELISA tests, PCRs, and so on. None of these are perfect, so they all have some degree of false positives and false negatives. So we need to understand and take all of that into account as well. So in terms of when we get a result, whatever test methodology we're using, it's not that a negative test result necessarily means that the herd is free of disease, or that a positive test means it's absolutely positive for disease. We tend to use the terminology low risk and high risk to represent those test results. We also do generate a percent positivity, so that's sort of on a continuous scale, the proportion of antibodies or whatever we're looking for in that bulk tank in that particular sample. So the higher the percent positivity, the larger the relative amount of antibody or whatever it is that we're looking for, but that doesn't necessarily translate into herd prevalence either, not on a single sample. So there are certainly some challenges, but also some opportunities. To start this project, Diego and a veterinary student, Julie French, did some work. They actually dove into the literature, and we actually found literally hundreds of tests that had been validated for use on bulk tank milk samples. And we were looking for their performance characteristics. So they're really digging into the literature to understand what methodologies had been used in various parts of the world, which tests had been validated, and which actually performed reasonably well. Based on all of that background, we came back together and at the end of the day decided that we would test for Johne's disease, bovine leukosis, and some contagious mastitis pathogens, particularly Staph aureus, Strep A, and Mycoplasma bovis, and then in terms of an emerging disease, Salmonella Dublin. All of the bulk tank samples were collected about a year ago now, in November 2021. The testing was done in partnership with Lactanet at their labs in Guelph and in Montreal. The testing unfortunately took a little bit longer than expected. There are some issues with availability of certain tests and the volumes and quantities we needed because of some supply chain disruptions, and then they had some staffing issues due to COVID, I think that many industries have experienced. So that took us a little bit longer than expected and than what we wanted to get the results back, but all the results were back and shared with producers back in this past August. The results of these tests went directly to producers, no one else. but they were encouraged to share those with their herd veterinarian, to use that as a jumping off point to talk about the disease status of the herd, biosecurity principles, and where they might go in the future. Based on the feedback that I've received and others, lots of phone calls and emails from veterinarians and dairy producers. So it did generate some of those conversations about what are logical next steps, what can we do, what should we do, what shouldn't we do, and so on. So I think we've achieved that, certainly that objective. We also developed some fact sheets to make sure that we had some information out there in the hands of the producers and also the veterinarians. And so for each of these diseases, a little bit about the disease, the test, how to interpret the results, some potential next steps, and some resources in terms of other information, web links, and those types of things. To give you a sense of what we learned, and none of this I think surprised any of us, but it sort of confirmed sort of where we are from a provincial dairy disease standpoint. So we had just under half of the bulk tanks test positive on the test that we were using. Most of those sort of were moderate risk, a small proportion were high risk. I'll come back and put these in context here in a moment. Leukosis was about 80%. Salmonella Dublin was about 7%. Staph aureus, about half of the herds. And strep A and Mycoplasma bovis, less than 1%, very small proportion. Again, suggesting that we're in a good place there. To put this in a little bit of context of other studies that have been done, particularly in Ontario, where we've got some way to sort of assess this and look at where we stand. So for instance, Yoni's, some of the earliest studies back in the early 2000s, so certainly 15, almost 20 years ago now, suggests about 35% of the herds. We get into sort of the early and mid to 2010s. So we had our Yoni's control program in Ontario from 2010 to 2013 or so. At the end of that, we had about half the bulk tanks positive. We did some follow-up in 2017 just to see how we had done, and we're a little bit surprised to see that in fact more of the bulk tanks were positive, and I'll come back and talk about that in a moment. Leukosis, our earliest information for Ontario, probably around 40 years ago now, about 40%. But again, more recent studies would suggest somewhere between 70 and 85%, so we fall into that range. Renee Bunkers will be up here as the next speaker, and she'll talk a bit more about leukosis. Salmonella Dublin, we're seeing an increase, again, not surprisingly, as an emerging disease, a lot of conversation about that. Staph aureus, we've been running around 50%. Back in the early 90s, we did some work where we did multiple tests on all herds. And if you look hard enough, you can find it probably in most herds. Strep A, prior to our implementation of the ratcheting down the sub-count program, we were running about 42%. This is Ann Godkin's work back in the mid-80s. But since then, we were able to pretty much eradicate strep A, and it's still at a very low level. Mycoplasma bovis, more of a concern in the US. Every time we look at it, we don't find a lot of it, and we're pretty happy about that. Just a few comments about Yoni's. This jump from 2013 to 2017, a little bit of concern. So that prompted some work that's been done by Jamie Amata, who's will be defending his PhD a couple of weeks from now. Some of the work to look at follow-up and understanding what's happening in terms of Yoni's disease prevalence in our dairy industry. And so I was interested in exploring a little bit more this potential jump in herd prevalence. As part of our original Yoni's program, we did a risk assessment and a farm management plan done by veterinarians with dairy producers. We repeated those, or Jamie repeated those on about 180 farms to try to document and understand what had changed in terms of Yoni's risk and herd management. We used the same form that we had developed and is still available on the Yoni's.ca website that sort of walked through a number of the high-risk practices and was able to score the farm on a semi-quantitative scale. In terms of what Jamie found, and I don't have time to go into a lot of the details, but certainly we're seeing a lot of changes. In some areas, farms in general decrease their risk, so less purchasing of cattle from outside sources, and when purchases were occurring from fewer sources, so that was a good news item. Certainly keeping sick cows and lame cows out of maternity pens was happening more frequently, and also feeding more low-risk colostrum, so that's on the positive side. Where we potentially are seeing some increased risk is as we change some of our concepts and thoughts about calf housing, for instance, in calf management. We're moving more into group calf housing, keeping calves with dams longer. One of the things we advocated in Yoni's program was rapid and immediate removal of that newborn calf. Feeding of bulk tank milk and in some cases non-saleable milk, so moving a bit away from milk replacer back to whole milk, and group housing of calves, all of which have a lot of benefits in many other areas, particularly in behavior and welfare, but I think still do pose some disease transmission risks. So we're still, there's some work to be done to understand that, but I think what it points out is that our farm management is very dynamic, and as we make changes in one area, there are potential implications in other areas, and I think we need to think about that and sort of track that as we look at what's going on in our industry. So that's sort of where we are now. We're planning a second round of testing this fall. It probably won't be exactly the same as what we did the first round, but we've got some research interests, particularly around leukosis and Salmonella Dublin, that we're going to pursue and tie in with this testing. Certainly we have, I think, accomplished some of what we hope to in terms of the dialogue between producers and veterinarians about disease prevalence, about disease management, about biosecurity. And there certainly has been some interest in some follow-up testing, and that would be at the cow or the group level. I think one of the things that we need to think about as an industry when we think about diseases that are endemic, like Yoni's, leukosis, and even Staph aureus, they're largely subclinical, so they don't necessarily confront us on a day-to-day basis, but they are production limiting and potentially trade limiting as well. In 2010 to 2013, when we instituted our Yoni's control program, not only here in Ontario, but other regions of Canada as well, had similar programs, and we spoke internationally with other countries, we were in fact leaders globally in some of the concepts about the risk assessment, the removal of high titer positive cows. Since then, it sort of dropped off our radar, and it's been interesting to see what some of the European countries who have stuck with it have managed to attain. And so I think what we need to think about is that our control strategies for some of these endemic diseases can't be based on sort of that 3 to 5 year cycle that we tend to think about in projects and in funding and so on, but we need to think about a longer term strategy if in fact we want to do something about some of these diseases. So again, I think that's one of those industry conversations that we need to have at some point here down the road. So with that, thank you for your attention. Again, to commend Dairy Farmers of Ontario for their logo on the Maple Leaf jerseys. I think all of us who are Leaf fans apologize for the performance of the Leafs so far, but we are optimistic that they'll turn things around, and Stephen is smiling as a Canadians fan.
I have that mental health number for you, Dave.
What's that?
She's offering me the mental health hotline.
Yes, thank you. Yes, yeah, we'll need that.
Questions for Dave, other than about the Leafs?
I wanted to know about, because you listed at the very beginning, low risk and high risk, and then one of the slides said moderate risk, so.
Yeah, so, great question. So most of the tests, we were sort of able to split them into low risk, high risk. With Yoni's, there is some support in the literature to sort of classify it into 3 levels, sort of. So the very low level test results, negative and low level, are low risk, moderate risk, high risk. Again, it's sort of taking that amount of antibody in that milk sample and sort of projecting and see what that sort of would suggest on a herd prevalence basis and how repeatable that is. So the high risk is certainly very highly repeatable. The moderate risk is there is some risk that that may be a false positive or a very small number of animals that are testing positive. So again, the way that one follows up, some of those might be a little bit different than the approach one takes to either cow testing or management strategies.
And when you said maybe some more testing this fall, does that mean more samples taken?
We will do another round, so the project was that we would do 2 rounds of testing in consecutive years. So we're now sort of in the process of discussing what that second round might look like and which diseases do we pursue the same diseases, do we do something different in order to maybe generate some different conversation or provide some different information.